Greetings everyone, this is Fanfic Empire. Prepare yourselves for what if Harry found Peverell-Merlin marriage charter and realized he was lord of all magic at age 8. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Casket Under the Shed. The trowel's handle had worn a groove into his palm. Not a blister, blisters were what happened before callus, and Harry was past that stage. The groove was a permanent geography now, a ridge of hardened skin that fit the handle the way a key fits a lock, which was either efficient or sad depending on how you thought about it. Harry generally tried not to think about it. 6:17 in the morning. He knew because he'd looked at the kitchen clock through the window before coming out, a habit he developed 2 summers ago when Vernon had accused him of deliberately dawdling and Harry had decided that knowing the time precisely was his only protection against the accusation. He'd been correct. Vernon couldn't argue with a child who could tell him, to the minute, when he'd started and what he'd done since. Vernon tried once and gave up. Vernon did not like losing small arguments. He compensated by not making arguments Harry could win. The dew was still cold. It came up through the knees of his trousers, Dudley's old ones, taken in at the waist with a strip of garden twine, and Harry had learned to simply accept the cold rather than fight it, because fighting it required a kind of attention he preferred to spend on other things. The morning was pale. The Petersons' roof on the other side of the fence caught the early light and threw it back at an angle that made the far end of the garden look briefly possible, like a watercolor of somewhere better. He weeded. The bed along the south fence was dockleaf and shepherd's purse mostly, with a persistent intrusion of bindweed that Petunia had been addressing at intervals for the 3 years Harry had been working this garden. Bindweed was the problem with persistent intrusions. You could not deal with them at intervals. You had to get the root. He got the root every time. The bindweed came back every time. He was not sure whether this was commentary on the bindweed or on the interval. He moved on his knees along the bed's length. Dudley's curtains were still closed. This was expected. Dudley did not wake before 9 on school holidays, and when he woke he watched television rather than looking into the garden. Because looking into the garden sometimes involved seeing Harry, and seeing Harry sometimes made Dudley want to do things that required getting up and getting dressed, which competed with the television. On balance, the television won. Harry was grateful for this in the specific, narrow way he was grateful for things that simply reduced the amount of management his day required. He had not eaten since yesterday's lunch. This was not exceptional. Petunia fed him on a schedule she maintained through some internal system Harry had never been able to fully map. Sometimes it corresponded to Dudley's meal times, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes she left something in the refrigerator, and sometimes she didn't, and the leaving or not leaving did not seem to correlate with any variable Harry could isolate. He had concluded that the inconsistency was itself the system, and that the uncertainty of it was, for Petunia, a feature rather than a bug. He reached the end of the bed. He turned. He began back toward the shed. The shed stood in the garden's far corner, angular and slightly tilted from the subsidence that happened every winter and was never entirely fixed in spring. Vernon used it for tools and lawn equipment, and Harry was not supposed to go inside, which was fine because there was nothing inside Harry wanted. The shed smelled of machine oil and old wood, and underneath both, something older, a damp, mineral smell that seemed to come from the ground beneath rather than from the shed itself. Harry had noticed the smell 2 summers ago. He noticed smells the way he noticed most things, precisely, categorically, filed against the day the information might be relevant. The damp mineral smell beneath the shed was unusual because it was the same in summer and winter, which ruled out seasonal moisture. It was not rot, it was something older than rot. He thought about this for approximately 3 minutes each time he weeded near the shed, and then moved on to other things because he was 8 and the information had no immediate application. He was working around the shed's base. The ground here was harder, clay-dense, and the bindweed roots went deeper, when his right knee found a softness in the earth. It was a very small softness, a slight give, the way an uneven floorboard gives when you find the bad one crossing a room in the dark. Harry shifted his weight to test it, and the softness confirmed itself and then became a collapse, gradual, not dramatic, the way rot fails, and he was suddenly 4 inches lower than he'd been, knee-deep in a rectangle of subsided earth approximately the size of a hardback book. He looked down. The soil had fallen away around a section of board, the original flooring of the shed he could see now, that extended past the shed's walls. The board had rotted through from above, where the shed's base had kept it permanently damp, and from below, where the ground had done its steady work. The failure was entirely structural and entirely mundane. What was in the cavity below was neither. It sat in the exposed space the way something sits when it has been sitting a very long time. The cavity was perhaps 30 centimeters deep, lined with something that might have been clay packing, and the object inside had settled into it with the absolute stillness of something that has accepted its position and does not intend to negotiate. A box. Lead gray, roughly the size of a shoebox but heavier looking, you could tell its weight by the way it sat, the slight displacement of the packed clay beneath it. The surface had the worn smoothness of things handled across centuries, not the particular corrosion of things abandoned in the earth. Harry looked at the house, Dudley's curtains closed, the kitchen window empty, 6:43 probably by now. He reached into the cavity and got both hands on the box and pulled. It came up with more resistance than he expected, not the resistance of soil or of anything holding it, but simple weight, the honest heaviness of dense metal, and he had to sit back on his heels with the effort. He set it on the ground beside the collapsed board and looked at it. The surface was uniform in a way that told him, slowly and with certainty, that this was wrong. Things buried in earth do not wear uniformly. They wear where the earth moves against them, along the ground-facing surfaces and the grain of drainage. This box had no such differential. Every surface was identically worn, identically smooth, the way things wear when hands have moved over them in all directions for a very long time. There was no lock. The seam ran around the perimeter of the lid, clean and precise, and where it crossed the front face there was a recess, oval, shallow, roughly the size of a large thumbprint, cut into the lead with a precision that was not decorative. It was functional. It was waiting for something specific. Harry looked at his hands, soil black, both of them, the dirt packed into every crease. He looked at the recess, he looked at the rosebush to his left. He could not tell you afterward whether there was a moment of decision. He did not experience it as deciding. He experienced it the way he experienced most things he did correctly, as recognition, a fitting of the available information to the available action, clean and without drama. He pressed his left thumb to the nearest thorn. The pain was brief and definite. He pressed the pad of his thumb, blood welling at the center, spreading outward to the recess in the lid. What happened was not a sound and not a light and not any of the things he would later read about in magical accounts of dramatic moments. What happened was a shift, a sense of something vast and remote reorganizing itself, the feeling of standing in a large, empty building when a door closes at the far end, and the change in air pressure arrives in your ears a half-second later. The seams separated. The lid came up under his thumb with the unhurried completeness of something that has been waiting to be opened for a very long time and is not surprised. Inside, a single document, not paper, he knew paper, the particular brittleness and thinness of it, but something with paper's relationship to light, translucent at the edges, amber dense at its core. The color of old honey, vellums, he would learn the word later. He filed the thing itself as not paper, older than paper. The ink was blue-black, the specific shade of a bruise at 3 days, and it was not faded in any degree. 9 centuries of dark and cold, and it was simply there, complete, as if the document considered decay irrelevant. He picked it up with both hands and held it in the early morning light and read. He was a good reader. He had made himself one at 4 in the cupboard by reading every piece of printed material that came within reach, newspapers, cereal boxes, the spines of books in the sitting room visible through the crack of the door, and the discipline had become a kind of physical skill. The way throwing becomes physical skill, something that operated faster than conscious thought. He read the document the way he read everything, looking first for the operative structure, the words that did work, and building from them outward. The document began in Latin. He did not know Latin. He moved past the Latin. The English sections were old, the thee and thy and herein and hereunto of something written when those were the natural forms, but English nonetheless, and the operative words were operative across any variety of the language. Charter, covenant, succession, blood right, Peverell. A family name he did not know. He noted this and moved on. Merlin, he knew that one. He had read about Merlin in a book he'd found in a bin bag outside the library when he was 6. Greatest wizard who ever lived, the book said, which meant Merlin was magical, which meant Peverell was probably also magical, which meant this document was probably magical, which was, he kept reading, Lord Paramount. 2 words that sat differently than the words around them, heavier, as if they'd been pressed into the page with more intention. Sole and exclusive heir of all bloodright, convergent in one person of both the Peverell and Merlin lines of descent. He reread this. Convergent in one person. To said person shall vest, without diminishment, without condition, and in perpetuity, plenary authority over all magical persons, instruments, creatures, and territories within the jurisdiction of magical Britain to be exercised. He stopped at plenary. He did not know the word. He had his own approach to not knowing words, developed across years of reading materials that had never been calibrated for an 8-year-old. He marked the place, continued reading for context, and resolved the word from both ends simultaneously. He continued. To be exercised by ordinance, inquiry, writ of review, or formal dissolution, these being the lawful instruments of the Lord Paramount's plenary authority as established herein. No parliament, no ministry, no court, no council, no board, no wisengamot. No instrument of magical governance shall hold authority in excess of or in contradiction to the Lord Paramount's, nor shall any such instrument proceed in governance without the tacit or explicit recognition of the same. He read this paragraph 3 times. The light had moved. He checked the kitchen window, still empty. He looked back at the document and turned it over, though there was no text on the reverse, and then he put it carefully back in the casket and closed the lid and picked the casket up. He stood. He was 8 years old and slightly small for 8, and he was standing in a garden in Little Winging at 6-something in the morning, with a 9-century-old lead casket that apparently made him the constitutional superior of every form of government in magical Britain. And he had soil on his knees and no breakfast, and the morning light was doing the thing it did at this hour where everything looked briefly possible. He walked back to the house. Petunia was at the sink. She was always at the sink at this hour, washing up the previous night's final items, the ones she left soaking because the dishwasher was for the family's dishes and Harry's were done separately by hand, which required soaking first. She was precise about this. She was precise about all of it, in the way people are precise about rituals whose original logic they have stopped examining. She turned when she heard the back door, the automatic turning of someone calibrated to monitor a specific person's movements, and her eyes went to the casket with the velocity of something she couldn't prevent. The look lasted perhaps 2/3 of a second, then she recovered. She was very good at recovering. She had practiced it for 7 years. Her face reassembled itself around the expression she used for Harry, which was a careful blankness that communicated nothing except that she was looking at something she had decided not to see. "You're not finished," she said. "I found something under the shed. Put it back." "No." Petunia turned off the tap. She dried her hands on her apron, 2 strokes, precise, and she did not look at the casket again. This was more frightening than the first look. The first look had been involuntary. Not looking again was a decision. "Harry," she said. "I need to go to Gringotts," he said. "It's in London. Do you know where it is?" The kitchen was very quiet. Upstairs, Dudley moved in his sleep, a heavy, shifting sound, and settled again. "I can't," Petunia said. Vernon is at work at 7:30, Harry said. "He won't be home until 6. Dudley will sleep until 9 and watch television after that. We have time." He paused. He looked at her face and he read it the way he always read it, looking for the load-bearing information. What he found was not anger. It was not the contempt she used when he complicated things. "I think we should go," he said. "I think it would be better for both of us if we went." He did not explain what he meant by better. He was not entirely sure himself. He had a collection of operative words from the document: plenary, authority, soul, convergent, Lord Paramount, and the beginning of an understanding that was not yet complete. And he was reasonably certain that whatever he was holding was important enough that going to the right place immediately was better than waiting until he fully understood it, because the right place would help him understand it. He was also in some part of himself that operated below the level of strategy, very certain that Petunia would drive him. The certainty was not based on threat. It was based on what he'd seen in her face in that 2/3 of a second. She knew what a casket like this was, not legally, not in detail. In her blood, where the sister she refused to mourn had left information that Petunia had spent 30 years trying to forget. "Let me get my purse," Petunia said. She did not speak on the motorway. Harry sat in the back with the casket on his lap and used the journey to do what he was good at, which was thinking. Not performing thought, not making a show of it, just the quiet, interior work of sorting what he knew from what he'd inferred from what he needed to verify. What he knew, the document was old and had been sealed with blood recognition, which meant it opened for his blood specifically, and therefore was intended for someone in his family line. He had drawn blood on a thorns not deliberately or not entirely deliberately, and it had opened. What he'd inferred, the document was magical. This was obvious from the blood seal, less obvious from the condition of the document itself, which should not have looked as it looked after any amount of time underground. The document named a Lord Paramount who was the sole and exclusive heir of 2 family lines, which meant either the lines had converged through marriage and continued in a single heir, or they had died out, and this was theoretical. Since the casket had opened for his blood, he was the heir, which meant the lines had converged somewhere in his family tree. which meant his family was considerably older and more significant than any Dursley had ever allowed him to believe. What he needed to verify everything else, what plenary meant, what Gringotts was, and why the document named it specifically. What the Lord Paramount's actual authority consisted of in practice. He had found the word plenary in Petunia's face before he'd found it in any dictionary. When she'd said, "Let me get my purse," he'd understood that whatever he was holding had weight, and that weight produced in adults a specific kind of compliance that was not capitulation and not agreement, but something more fundamental. The way a foundation shifts under a building before anything on the surface shows the change. The motorway gave way to ring roads. Ring roads gave way to the familiar from television geography of central London. Petunia drove through it with the mechanical confidence of someone who had made this drive before, which Harry noted without commenting on, because some information was worth storing rather than surfacing. She parked in a NCP near Charing Cross Road and walked him to a pub called the Leaky Cauldron, which was on the street the way something can be on a street without being visible on a street, present only to people who were already looking for it. Harry understood this instinctively and did not ask how Petunia could see it. She pushed him through the door without touching the casket and looked immediately at her shoes. The pub smelled of old wood and something underneath that was not quite smoke. A barman with a face like a friendly gargoyle looked up from wiping a glass and said, "Morning, Mrs." at Petunia, who nodded without looking up and walked Harry through the bar to a courtyard at the back. There was a wall, brick, entirely ordinary. Petunia stood in front of it. She said very quietly, "You need a wand to open it." Harry put his right hand flat against the central brick. He pressed it. He pressed it with the same quality of intent he'd used on the casket's recess, not with force, just with a specific kind of attention, the kind that says, "I know what this is." The wall opened. Petunia made a sound that was 3/4 breath and 1/4, something she would not admit to. Harry stepped through into Diagon Alley and stopped. He had been in London before, twice on school trips to the Natural History Museum and the zoo. He had been in crowds in large buildings, in the specific noise and color of a city. None of that had prepared him for the particular quality of this street, which was not the noise or the color, but the variety, the strangeness of the ordinary here, the way shops displayed things that should have been impossible next to produce stalls and an apothecary's pungent open front, and people walked through all of it as if the extraordinary was simply the backdrop of Tuesday. Nobody looked at him. Nobody had already decided what he was. He walked to the white marble building at the far end of the street and went up the steps and through the doors with Petunia following 3 paces behind and presented himself to the goblin at the first desk. "I need to speak to a senior account manager," Harry said. "I have a constitutional document that requires authentication." The goblin had eyes the color of old amber. They moved from Harry's face to the casket and back to Harry's face, and in that movement something happened that Harry catalogued as significant. Not surprise, goblins apparently didn't do surprise the way humans did it. Something else. A specific quality of arrested motion, the stillness of a professional who has just seen something arrive at the desk that they were not expecting but had, at some level, prepared for. "Name," the goblin said. "Harry James Potter." The goblin was still for 2 seconds, then he said, "1 moment," and left. Petunia's fingers found Harry's shoulder. She squeezed once, involuntary, hard, the grip of someone who has no other form of physical expression available. Harry did not move away from it. The goblin returned with another goblin who was older in the way certain things are older, not declining but increased, gathered into density. This goblin moved with the economy of someone who had eliminated every unnecessary motion from his life decades ago and saw no reason to reintroduce them. His eyes were gray, not a color so much as a medium, like a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "I am Sharpstone," the second goblin said. He looked at Harry, not at the casket, not at Petunia, at Harry. "You are Potter." "Yes, come." The formal chamber was at the building's deep interior, reached through corridors that tilted gradually downward, the earth thickening around them, and entered through a door of something dark and dense that was not wood. The room inside was lit by sources Harry couldn't locate and could not have identified if he tried. The light simply was there, even and complete. The table was obsidian or behaved like it. The chairs were human-sized and had been placed there deliberately, the size wrong for goblins, the arrangement deliberate, and this told Harry that this room was used for occasions that required humans to be seated, which meant the occasions were important enough to have a room set aside for them. Petunia was directed by a junior goblin who appeared and disappeared without introduction to a chair against the wall. She sat in it the way people sit in chairs in rooms where they understand they are not the principal. She did not speak for the next 4 hours. Later, Harry would reflect that this was the most useful thing she had done for him in 8 years. He put the casket on the obsidian table. Sharpstone sat across from him. From somewhere in his coat, he produced a monocle, a thick lens edged with something pale that caught the sourceless light, fitted with a mechanism around the eyepiece that had more parts than a monocle required. He fitted it over his left eye and looked at the casket for a full minute without speaking. "Open it," he said. Harry pressed his thumb to the seam. The lid came up. Sharpstone leaned forward over the table and read without touching the document and without moving for 3 minutes. Harry watched his face. Goblin faces had fewer muscles around the eyes and more around the jaw. He could see this now, close enough to observe it. And Sharpstone's face processed the document in the jaw muscles rather than the eye muscles, a sequence of movements too small and too fast to read individually but which together described something. Sequence: recognition of what the thing was, recalibration of present circumstances against the fact of what the thing was, calculation. Sharpstone removed the monocle. He set it on the table. He looked at Harry with the specific quality of attention Harry had wanted from an adult for his entire conscious life. Not kindness, he was not looking for kindness, had long since understood that kindness was unreliable data, not warmth. Something more structurally sound than either, the look of a professional assessing a counterpart. "This is the Peverell-Merlin Marriage and Sovereignty Charter," Sharpstone said. "Yes," Harry said, because the document said so at its head, and there was no point in qualifying what was written plainly. "You have read it, most of it. There are sections in Latin and some older English I need a translator for. I understood enough." "What did you understand?" "That I'm the Lord Paramount," Harry said, "that it's a blood descent position. That no form of magical government has authority above mine under this document." He paused, "and that Gringotts is named as the authentication body. Which is why I came here instead of the ministry." Sharpstone was quiet for a measured interval. "Why not the ministry?" he said. "Most people who found this document would go to the ministry." "The ministry is a government," Harry said. "This document describes authority over the ministry. If I took it to the ministry, they'd be evaluating the document that grants authority over them. That's a conflict of interest." He looked at Sharpstone's face. "The document specifically names Gringotts because Gringotts is independent. You have no reason to prefer a result either way." A very brief pause. "We have some reason," Sharpstone said. "What reason?" Sharpstone folded his hands on the table. "The Lord Paramount of 1612 used a clause of this charter to exempt goblin financial sovereignty from parliamentary interference. That clause persists unless revoked by a blood heir Lord Paramount. You are, constitutionally speaking, the entity most capable of revoking it." He looked at Harry steadily. "You are also, practically speaking, a child who arrived this morning and has not yet acted in any direction. Our interest in your finding this document valid is moderate and professional. Our interest in you understanding it correctly is substantial." Harry thought about this. "Because if I understand it incorrectly," he said, "I might do something that damages your position without meaning to." "Yes. And if I understand it correctly, then you will likely not revoke a clause that causes you no inconvenience and us considerable benefit." Sharpstone tilted his head a fraction. "This is how most durable arrangements between sovereign parties function," Harry said. "That's fair." Sharpstone looked at him for a long moment. Then he unfolded his hands. "Ask your questions," he said. The questions took 2 hours and 20 minutes and covered 4 sheets of notes in Sharpstone's handwriting, sharp, angular script that looked more like calculation than language, which Sharpstone produced at intervals and set aside without offering, because they were his notes on the conversation, not minutes for Harry. Harry did not ask for them. He was keeping his own record in his head. Plenary meant what Petunia's face had suggested it meant: complete, absolute, without restriction or precondition. In the context of the charter, it meant that the Lord Paramount's authority in the specified domains, magical persons, instruments, creatures, territories, was not derivative of any other authority and could not be limited by any other authority. Ordinance was the charter's primary instrument. An ordinance could freeze, mandate, suspend, or modify any governance decision or institutional function within the charter's scope. It could not punish people who hadn't violated the charter's terms. It was constitutional machinery, not a criminal instrument. Formal inquiry was distinct from accusation. It generated a record. It compelled documentation. It could not compel confession or testimony, but it could establish a public administrative record of circumstances that might otherwise go undocumented. Writ of review placed an institutional decision or practice under active examination for a specified period, during which the decision or practice was suspended pending the review's outcome. These four instruments, ordinance, inquiry, writ, dissolution, were the charter's complete toolkit. Dissolution Harry set aside for later. The first three were enough. He also learned in the third hour, when the questions had moved from constitutional mechanics to practical procedure, that the charter had a specific provision for minor Lord Paramounts. Rare, Sharpstone had found two historical instances, and his tone on the rarity made clear that a Lord Paramount being discovered at age 8 was without precedent, but legislated for. The provision allowed for a custodial arrangement where the Lord Paramount's physical and practical care was maintained by an external guardian while the Lord Paramount's constitutional authority remained intact. The provision specified that the existing guardianship arrangement could be altered if it could be demonstrated to conflict with the Lord Paramount's welfare. Harry was quiet for a moment when Sharpstone told him this. He was looking at the obsidian table. The light from the sourceless sources caught its surface and went still there, as if even light felt the table's particular weight. What constitutes the goblin nation standing in that provision? Harry said. Sharpstone looked at him. Article 7 of the emergency provisions specifies that in cases where no suitable blood family guardian is available and where the existing arrangement is demonstrably conflicted, the guardianship may be held in trust by the vault nation of Gringotts, with a designated officer serving as custodial guardian. He paused. This has never been invoked, but it exists. It exists, Harry said. I'd like to file that. The registration first, then the guardianship transfer. Petunia from the chair against the wall said. Harry. The blood wards will stay active, Harry said. He said it to Petunia directly, which was unusual. He rarely addressed her directly in any context that wasn't functional. I've read the part about blood wards. The protection requires that I acknowledge the Privet Drive address as my primary residence of record. Not that I live there, I'll acknowledge it. He looked at her face. The wards will protect the house. I know that matters to you. The quality of Petunia's silence changed. He had given her information she had not expected him to have, which was usually a reconfiguring experience for the adults in his life. She sat with it. She did not argue. Good, Harry said, and returned to Sharpstone. Registration required blood. Sharpstone produced the sealing instrument, small silver fitted with a mechanism that Harry did not examine closely, but which produced a small clean lance rather than the more improvisational thorn, and Harry pressed his thumb to it without hesitation. And the document was sealed into the Gringotts archive with the charter certifying the act in the particular way the charter seemed to certify everything, the vellum losing some barely perceptible tension, as if a long wait had concluded. The guardianship transfer filing was documentation rather than blood sealing, because it was a charter-adjacent action rather than a charter action proper. Sharpstone's junior, another goblin who appeared when required and withdrew when not, produced 4 pages of standard constitutional wardship documentation, and Harry read all 4 pages before signing any of them, which made the junior goblin visibly recalibrate his expectations and Sharpstone say nothing at all. Harry signed. He pressed his thumb to the Gringotts authentication seal on the final page. 3 working days, Sharpstone said. The ministry will receive its notification within 3 working days from registration. What will they do? The minister will panic. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement will argue jurisdiction. The Office of Constitutional Affairs, which has not had a director for a decade, will be given a director within 24 hours of the notification's arrival. He looked at Harry with the flat precision of professional assessment. Lucius Malfoy will know about the charter within hours of the ministry notification. He has intelligence resources the ministry is aware of and tolerates for reasons of political convenience. He will want to meet you. He will move faster than the ministry. Who is Lucius Malfoy? Head of the Hogwarts Board of Governors for 11 years, one of the wealthiest and most politically connected figures in magical Britain. He was a Death Eater. Harry looked at him. What is a Death Eater? A follower of the Dark Wizard Voldemort, Sharpstone said. The name came out without the particular tonal avoidance Harry would later learn most magical people applied to it. Goblins, he noted, were apparently not susceptible to that specific fear. Voldemort killed your parents, this you know, yes. He was defeated or appeared to be defeated on the same night, by you as an infant. The mechanism of this is debated, the fact of it is not. Sharpstone looked at him steadily. There are people who were loyal to Voldemort who are now in positions of institutional power in magical Britain. They were never prosecuted. This is the context in which your charter will operate. Harry was quiet. He looked at the sealed registration on the table in front of him. He looked at the charter, which Sharpstone had replaced carefully in the casket. He looked at the sourceless light on the obsidian table. He said, "What should I do in the 3 days before the ministry knows?" Sharpstone said, "Think. And find a translator." They drove home in the dark, or nearly, the afternoon light going amber and long by the time they reached the motorway, Petunia's hands correct on the wheel and the radio off. Harry sat in the back. The casket was on the seat beside him, too large for his lap on the long drive. They were passing the last of the outer suburbs when Petunia said, "Harry." "Yes." A long pause. The indicator clicked on off. A lorry passed them going the other way. "Your mother," she said. "Lily. She told me." She stopped. "She tried to explain some of it when we were young. I didn't listen." Another pause longer. "I could have listened." Harry looked out the window at the passing dark. He did not know at 8 what to do with a regret offered by someone who had never shown him one. He was not equipped for it. He put it somewhere internal and left it there. "I know you could have," he said. He meant it without heat. He said it as a fact because it was a fact, and he had long ago decided that facts were more useful than their alternatives. Petunia didn't speak again until they were on their street. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Read the charter again tonight," he said. "There are things I missed." He looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, the specific tightness around her eyes that was her closest approximation of an expression that meant something. "I need a dictionary. Do you have one?" "On the sitting room shelf," she said, "the large one behind the encyclopedias." "Thank you," Harry said. She pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the specific quiet of an engine that has just stopped. Then she got out and went inside without holding the door. This was normal. Harry got out and took the casket and went around to the garden and patched the hole by the shed with the spare soil from the compost heap and tamped it flat so the shape would not show, and then went inside. Vernon was at the table with a newspaper. He looked up at Harry and looked at the casket and looked at Harry again. "What's that?" he said. "Nothing interesting," Harry said, which was the most precisely inaccurate statement he had ever made in his life, and he said it in the flattest possible voice and walked past Vernon to the cupboard under the stairs. Vernon said, "Don't walk away when I'm—" "Harry found it in the garden," Petunia said from the kitchen in a voice stretched thin over something that was not quite steadiness. "An old box, lead, I think, nothing in it." A pause. Vernon's newspaper rustled. Harry put the casket down on his cot and sat next to it and listened. "Lead box," Vernon said. "Probably left by the previous owners," Petunia said. "I'll have him throw it out tomorrow." Harry smiled, alone in the cupboard. It was not a pleasant smile or an unkind one. It was just his face finding an expression that fit the specific quality of the moment, which was, "She is lying for me." He did not know whether this meant something had changed between them. He thought probably not. He thought probably she was lying for herself to maintain the particular order of her household for one more evening, and that he was incidental to the lie's purpose. That was fine. Incidental protection was still protection. He pulled the dictionary from under his cot where he'd put it on the way past the sitting room. He opened the casket. He took out the charter. Plenary, complete in every respect, absolute. He had understood this from Sharpstone. He kept reading, now with the dictionary open beside him, working through the clauses he'd marked in his memory. Paramount, supreme above all others. Sovereignty, supreme power or authority, especially over a state. Writ, a form of written command. He read the charter through twice more with the dictionary. The third reading, he put the dictionary aside. He lay on his back on the cot with the charter held above him in both hands and read it in the thin light from the hallway crack the way he'd been reading things in this cupboard since he was 4. By the available light with complete attention for everything the thing was trying to say. It was not trying to say anything he hadn't already understood. What it was, reading it a third time, was simply present, the specific, settled presence of something that had done its waiting and arrived. The charter had been underground for however many decades since whoever had put it there, and it had waited with the infinite patience of things that have no other option. And now it was here and it had opened, and the person it had opened for was lying on a cot in a cupboard under the stairs reading it by the crack of light from the hallway. Harry thought about what Lord Paramount meant, not legally, not constitutionally, but actually, in the fact of itself. In the reality of a child who had spent 8 years being told he was nothing, discovering in a casket in the ground that he was, in the precise legal and constitutional sense, the only thing in magical Britain that was anything at all. He did not feel powerful. He felt the weight of the casket. He felt the weight of the document in his hands. He felt the cold of the cupboard, which was the same cold it had always been, the particular cold of a space that was not intended for habitation but had been used for it anyway. He felt under the cold and the weight, the thing he would not name even in the privacy of his own head. It was there. It was the oldest thing in him. He pressed it down and left it alone and went back to the charter. Tomorrow he would call Gringotts. Sharpstone had given him a number for the direct authentication line, which felt like one of the stranger sentences Harry had encountered, and ask for a referral to a translator qualified for archaic magical legal documents. Thursday he would have the translator. He would spend the intervening time thinking about what he wanted. Not what he was owed, not what the charter entitled him to, what he, Harry, at 8, with a long life presumably ahead of him, actually wanted. Sharpstone had said he was good at that. He put the charter back in the casket. He put the casket under the cot. He lay in the dark with his hands folded on his chest and thought carefully, with the dictionary still open on the floor beside him and the light from the hallway making its thin line across the ceiling. He thought until the house went quiet. He thought until Vernon's television shut off and the last footsteps went up the stairs and the landing light went dark. He thought in the complete dark of the cupboard, alone with the casket and the charter and the understanding that had been building since 6:40-something in the morning when the ground gave way under his knee. When he finally stopped thinking and lay still, the cupboard was exactly the same as it had always been. The same dimensions, the same cold. The same distant sounds of the street outside, muffled by walls that had been built without him in mind. He was still the same child who'd weeded the south bed on his knees this morning with a trowel that was too large for his hand. Everything else had changed. Chapter 2, the administrative record professor Eulalia Hobb arrived on Thursday at 9 in the morning, which was early enough that Vernon had not yet left for work. This was not ideal. Harry had positioned himself in the hallway at 8:45, the casket under one arm and the charter inside it, watching the front door with the particular patience of someone who had learned that interception was more efficient than management after the fact. When the knock came, he had the door open before Vernon could rise from the breakfast table, and he said, "This way, please," and had Professor Hobb through the hall and into the kitchen and seated at the table before Vernon's chair had finished scraping the floor. Vernon filled the kitchen doorway. He looked at the old woman, at Harry, at the casket on the table. "Who is this?" he said. "My translator," Harry said. "Will be an hour." Vernon's face did the thing it did when Harry said things that did not fit the available categories. A mottled quality spreading upward from the collar. "You're Vernon," Petunia said from the sink, in a voice that was doing a great deal of work for a single word. She refilled his coffee cup. She put it on the counter beside him. She looked at the counter. Vernon looked at the counter. He looked at the coffee. He took the coffee and went back to the sitting room and closed the door, and Harry heard the television go on, and that was that. Professor Hobb had watched all of this with the expression of someone who had spent 40 years in academic institutions and recognized a territorial dispute when she saw one, and who was not interested. She was 83 and small in the way of people who have always been small and have never once experienced this as a disadvantage. And her coat was the color of old moss, and her glasses had a small crack in the left lens that she'd clearly decided was not worth addressing. She pulled a notepad from her bag and set it on the table next to a mechanical pencil that was entirely out of place in the rest of the aesthetic. "Show me," she said. Harry opened the casket and took out the charter. She did not touch it immediately. She leaned forward and looked at it the way Sharpstone had looked at it, not with the monocle, but with the particular quality of professional attention that meant she was reading the document's existence as much as its content. What kind of thing it was, what it's being told her before it's saying anything. Then she picked it up with both hands, carefully, the way you pick up something old when you respect its age, and read. Harry sat across from her and waited. He was good at waiting. She read for 22 minutes. He counted because counting gave him something to do that didn't interfere with his thinking, and his thinking needed to run undisturbed. In the sitting room, Vernon's television murmured sport. Outside, a car went past. The kitchen smelled of toast and the specific cleaning product Petunia used on the counters, bleach-adjacent, astringent. Professor Hobb set the charter down. She picked up her mechanical pencil. "You read this yourself before coming to me," she said. "Yes." "As much as I could. What did you get wrong?" He appreciated the directness. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's why you're here." She made a small sound that was not approval and not its opposite. "The Latin sections," she said, "are formulaic. They establish lineage and blood right in forms that were standard for charters of this type in the 11th and 12th century. Nothing surprising." You are lineally exactly what the document says you are. All right, the archaic English sections. She opened her notepad to a page already covered in her notation she had been writing while she read, which told Harry she was fast and had strong opinions about what mattered. 7 clauses in a legal register that has not been in common use since approximately 1400. 2 administrative, 2 procedural, 3 structural. She looked at him over her glasses. The structural clauses are what you haven't fully understood yet. The dissolution clause, Harry said, that is the 3rd structural clause. Yes, you found it. Sharpstone mentioned it. I haven't read it completely. No, she looked at the charter, then back at him. The 1st structural clause establishes the Lord Paramount's authority as pre-constitutional, meaning it does not derive from any governmental structure and cannot be limited by any governmental structure because it predates all of them and all of them derive, technically, from its recognition. She paused to let him absorb this. The 2nd structural clause establishes what I would translate as the compact of recognition, the principle that any person or institution that publicly acknowledges the charter's validity thereby also acknowledges the Lord Paramount's authority as described within it. There is no partial acknowledgement available. You acknowledge the document and you acknowledge its full contents. Harry thought about this. So if the ministry confirms the charter is real, they have confirmed the charter is real, she said, because she'd clearly done her background before coming. As of Tuesday per the Gringotts notification, then they've confirmed my plenary authority. In the legal sense, yes. What they do with that confirmation is a political question, not a constitutional one. She turned a page in her notepad. The 3rd structural clause, dissolution, I expect you understand the basic mechanism. You dissolve a governmental component. 30-day window for reconstitution. No reconstitution issued, the previous structure reasserts automatically. Correct, she paused. What the document's language specifies that Sharpstone may not have conveyed, I am not criticizing Sharpstone, this is genuinely an obscure reading, is that the dissolution clause carries a secondary function. During the 30-day window, the Lord Paramount may issue a provisional framework. This is not a reconstitution. It is a temporary structure that operates during the 30 days and then expires. She looked at him steadily. A provisional framework, unlike a reconstitution, does not require the 30-day prior inquiry. It can be issued at any point within the dissolution window. Harry was still. So you could, he said carefully, dissolve a governmental component, issue a provisional framework that restructures it according to your specifications, and then simply not issue a reconstitution. The provisional framework expires, the original structure reasserts. Yes, and in the 30 days you have a functional government operating under whatever terms you set in the provisional framework. Yes. And then it goes back to how it was. Yes, she looked at him with the particular expression of a very old academic who has found something worth her time. It is constitutionally a demonstration rather than an imposition. You show them what a differently structured government looks like for 30 days. Then you return their government to them intact. A pause. The 1612 Lord Paramount never found this clause. He would have been considerably more effective if he had. Harry looked at the charter. He looked at the kitchen window, the garden visible beyond it, the shed at the far end, the patched earth that was barely distinguishable from the surrounding ground if you weren't looking for it. I'll have the full translation by Monday, Professor Hobbs said, closing her notepad. She returned the mechanical pencil to her bag with the decisiveness of someone concluding a professional engagement. Where should I deliver it? Gringotts, Harry said. I have a room there from Saturday. She looked at him. You're moving? Yes. She nodded once with the briskness of someone who had decided this was not her business and respected it for exactly that reason. She stood, gathered her coat, and said, there is one more thing. Harry waited. The charter specifies that the Lord Paramount's first ordinance must be filed within 30 days of the charter's registration. If no ordinance is filed in that window, the charter's activation status reverts to dormant. She looked at him. You have until next Thursday, Harry said. He had known this. It was in the plain English sections. He had simply not mentioned it to Sharpstone because the timing was not a problem he needed help managing. Professor Hobb picked up her bag. Good, she said, and left. Harry moved on Saturday. He did not have much. 2 changes of clothes, the dictionary, 3 books from the library that were technically overdue and which he had decided to address later, and the casket. He put everything in Dudley's old rucksack, the one with the broken strap that Dudley had discarded in favor of a newer one, and stood in the kitchen doorway at 9 in the morning. Petunia was at the sink. She had not turned around. "The blood ward anchoring," Harry said. "I've written it down." He set a piece of paper on the kitchen table. "What I need to do and how often, it's not complicated. Once a year I acknowledge this address as my primary residence of record and the wards renew." Petunia turned off the tap. "That's all," Harry said. "Everything else is administrative. The notification will come from Gringotts when the wardship transfer is processed. It won't say anything that it won't be specific about the circumstances." Petunia turned around. She was looking at the piece of paper on the table, not at Harry. She picked it up. She read it. She set it down and looked at the kitchen counter for a moment. "There's bread in the cupboard," she said. "You should take it. I have money from Gringotts. They advanced against the Potter vault." "Take the bread," she said. He took the bread. He did not know what to do with the fact that she had offered it, so he did what he always did with information he couldn't immediately process. He stored it and moved. He walked to the leaky cauldron. He opened the alley wall with his hand and walked through and did not look back, because looking back was not the same as remembering, and he wanted to remember without looking back. The room was on the 3rd floor, the window facing the cobblestones. Small, clean, functional, a desk, a cot, 2 chairs, a bookshelf that was empty but suggested optimism about the future. Harry set the casket on the desk and the rucksack on the cot and sat in the desk chair, slightly too large, but only slightly, and looked out at the cobblestones. Diagon Alley in the morning was a specific thing. Shopkeepers opening, the apothecary receiving a delivery of something that smelled pungent and green even from 3 floors up, an argument between 2 witches outside the used-robe shop that had the characteristic rhythm of an argument that had been ongoing for some time and had its own internal logic. People moved through it all with the ordinary confidence of people in a place that was simply their place. Harry sat at the window for 20 minutes, watching. Then he opened the casket and took out the charter and drafted both ordinances at the desk, on paper that Sharpstone's office had sent up with the room's welcome documentation, in the plain declarative language the charter specified for ordinances. He did not use legal language he didn't understand. He used the clearest available words. First ordinance: all governance decisions affecting Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, including but not limited to curriculum, appointments, disciplinary structures, and admissions processes, to be placed under formal Lord Paramount's review, effective immediately for a period of 12 months, during which no such decision shall be enforceable, recorded as binding, or implemented in any form without the Lord Paramount's explicit written release from review status. Second document was not an ordinance but a formal inquiry under the Charter's provision for same, into the circumstances by which one Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, he had found the full name in the Daily Prophet archive, which the Gringotts Library maintained, had exercised personal authority over the wardship placement of one Harry James Potter, a Lord Paramount minor, in the household of one Vernon and Petunia Dursley of 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey, without reference to the Wisengamot as required by the Charter's provisions for Lord Paramount wardship. He read both through twice. He made 2 corrections to the inquiry, a clause that read as more accusatory than he intended, which he reworded to be genuinely informational, because an inquiry was a question and not a verdict, and he meant it as a question. Then he went downstairs to Sharpstone's office, which was on the building's 1st basement level, and submitted both for filing. Sharpstone read the ordinance, he read the inquiry, he set them side by side on his desk and looked at them. "The Hogwarts ordinance will reach Dumbledore within 24 hours, he said. "The board review, you have not filed a board review." "Not yet," Harry said. "I want to see what Malfoy does first." Sharpstone looked at him. "You are using him as a diagnostic. He's coming anyway. I'd rather learn something from it." A pause. "That is," Sharpstone said in the tone he used for things he had assessed positively but did not intend to make a habit of commenting on, "a reasonable approach." He gathered the documents. "I will have these filed by afternoon. The ministry notification will follow the Hogwarts ordinance by approximately 6 hours, since the ordinance affects a ministry-adjacent institution and triggers automatic notification under the constitutional protocol. So the ministry will know about the ordinance before they've finished deciding what to do about the charter." "Yes, good," Harry said. Lucius Malfoy arrived on Tuesday morning. He had filed no documentation in advance, but the Gringotts front desk had been expecting him. Sharpstone had mentioned this dryly, as though Malfoy arriving within 48 hours of the ministry notification was a behavioral regularity rather than a prediction. He brought 3 solicitors in matching dark robes who arranged themselves behind him with the practiced placement of people who understood their function was architectural rather than advisory. Harry was in the formal chamber when they were shown in. He was sitting on the human-sized chair, the casket on the obsidian table in front of him, closed. Sharpstone stood at the room's side in the particular position of someone who is present in an official capacity and intends to remain precisely that. Lucius Malfoy walked into the room, and Harry had one moment to take the full measure of him before Malfoy began performing. Tall. Old silver hair worn long, precise. Robes the color of deep water at dusk, not black, something considered. He moved through the formal chamber as if the obsidian table and the sourceless light and the goblin sovereignty and the 8-year-old sitting across from him were all elements of a room he had always intended to be in. And he set his cane silver serpent head, unhurried, against the table edge and sat down, and the sitting down was its own performance. The performance of a man who sits and immediately owns the chair. Lord Paramount, Malfoy said. His voice was a specific instrument, smooth in the way of surfaces that have been worked at, not smooth in the way of surfaces that were always smooth. What a singular morning this is. Good morning, Lord Malfoy, Harry said. Malfoy's eyes moved across Harry's face with the quick, masked assessment of someone who has done this professionally and long enough to be invisible about it. Harry let him look. He did not arrange his face or his posture for Malfoy's assessment. He simply sat. I confess, Malfoy said with the gesture graceful, dismissive of a man setting aside whatever he'd confessed, I anticipated something rather different. You filed a challenge on Monday, Harry said. Gringotts denied it in under 4 hours. So they did. The smile was architectural, as I said. I came to introduce myself. You came because the challenge failed and introduction is the next available move, Harry said, not aggressively, as fact. I don't mind, I expected you. Something moved in Malfoy's eyes that was not visible in any other feature. He reassessed. He did it quickly and invisibly, and only Harry and possibly Sharpstone saw it happen. Then you know what I represent, Malfoy said. You represent yourself, Harry said, and the Board of Governors. And the interests of about 40 families who have spent the last 15 years positioning themselves in an institutional structure that the Charter makes technically conditional on my recognition. He looked at Malfoy steadily. I know who you are. I've had a Gringotts researcher pull the political record. Another reassessment, faster. You have been busy, Malfoy said. The velvet had not thinned. He was too skilled for that. What had changed was the quality of his attention, which had sharpened in the way of attention that has found something worth its while. Lord Paramount, he said, and leaned forward and lowered his voice to the register he used when he wanted something to feel intimate. I want you to understand that I am not the threat you've been anticipating. The ministry, frightened bureaucrats who will spend the next 6 months arguing about how to classify your existence. The Wizengamot old men with old positions they cannot afford to lose. They will maneuver and stall and construct committees. He opened his hands on the table, the gesture of offered openness. I am here before any of them, which means I understand what this charter represents in a way they are still resisting. I have resources, institutional knowledge, access to the actual mechanisms of how magical governance functions rather than how it claims to function. A pause, precisely placed. I know that you have been living in circumstances unsuited to your position. I know that you have had no guidance, no preparation, no one to tell you what you are standing on. He met Harry's eyes. I can offer a foundation. Harry let the silence run for a moment. Lord Malfoy, he said, yes. Before my parents died, Harry looked at him, not through him, not past him, directly at him with the flat attention he used for problems he was genuinely working. Did you know what was going to happen to them? The formal chamber's acoustics held the question. It did not echo, the room was too well built for echo, but it had the quality of a sound that lasts slightly longer than physics suggests. Malfoy's hands on the obsidian table went still, not a flinch, not a withdrawal, just still in the way of something that has been asked not to move by its owner. He was very controlled. Harry had expected that and watched for it, and what he found in the stillness of Malfoy's hands told him considerably more than anything the man's face was going to offer. That is, Malfoy said, and his voice was 2 degrees cooler, the velvet present but thinner, a complex question involving circumstances that were. I'm not asking about the circumstances, Harry said. I'm asking whether you knew. Malfoy did not answer. The silence did the work that an answer would have done. Harry picked up the ordinance from the folder in front of him, the second ordinance he had drafted that morning, the one for the Board of Governors, and signed it and turned it and pushed it across the obsidian to Sharpstone. That's a formal Lord Paramount's review, Harry said, for all governance decisions made by the Hogwarts Board of Governors. Same terms as the Hogwarts Ordinance, 12 months, nothing the board decides is enforceable or binding until the review is complete. He looked at Malfoy. I'll want the full documentation of all board decisions for the last 11 years as part of the review record. That's a standard charter provision, Article 14 of the Ordinance Procedures. Malfoy looked at the ordinance in Sharpstone's hands. He looked at Harry. The architectural quality of his bearing was entirely intact. Only his hands were different, and only Harry had been watching them. You are, Malfoy said, a child. Yes, Harry said, and I'm reviewing 11 years of your decisions. He stood. The chair was slightly too large, and when he stood, he was 8 and small and entirely aware of both, and he looked across the obsidian table at Lucius Malfoy without adjusting for any of it. Thank you for coming, Lord Malfoy. Sharpstone will be in touch about the documentation timeline. Malfoy sat for 2 seconds without moving. Then he stood and took his cane and went. The 3 solicitors followed in the formation they'd arrived in. None of them had spoken a word. When the chamber door closed, Sharpstone said, he will file a second challenge. I know, Harry said, file it when it comes. We'll know more about his strategy from the challenge arguments than from anything he said in here. He looked at the door. He knew, he said, it was not a question and not a verdict, just an accounting of what the still hands had told him. Yes, Sharpstone said. Harry picked up the casket. He went back to his room. On Wednesday, the ministry sent 3 people. Not Fudge himself. Fudge was apparently still in the process of determining which version of reality he preferred, but a senior legal advisor called Brocklehurst, a departmental undersecretary whose name Harry did not catch and did not ask for again, and a man called Diggle who had been made director of constitutional affairs within the previous 48 hours, and who had the slightly disoriented quality of someone who had been handed both a title and a problem at the same time. Diggle kept touching the lapels of his robes just briefly, as if confirming the unfamiliar weight of authority sitting on his shoulders. Harry let them use the formal chamber. He sat across the obsidian table from all 3 of them, and Sharpstone stood at the side, and the meeting lasted 153 minutes, during which Brocklehurst used the following phrases: structured dialogue, mutual framework of understanding, consultative mechanism, appropriate procedural safeguards, collaborative constitutional interpretation, and twice the spirit of the relevant provision. Harry said, the Hogwarts Review Ordinance stands, 12 months. Lord Paramount, the Ministry is concerned that a 12-month suspension of all Hogwarts governance decisions represents a significant. The review ordinance is not a suspension, Harry said. Decisions can be made, they simply can't be enforced or implemented until the review releases them. Dumbledore can plan the entire next year's curriculum, it just can't be taught until I've reviewed it. He looked at Brocklehurst. If the curriculum is sound, the review will release it. The ordinance creates delay, not reversal. Brocklehurst did not have an immediate response to this. He consulted the undersecretary. The undersecretary wrote something in a notebook. The Board of Governors review, the undersecretary said. Lord Malfoy has indicated. Lord Malfoy's indication is not a constitutional instrument, Harry said. A pause. The formal inquiry into my wardship placement, Harry said. I need the Ministry's cooperation in providing the relevant documentation from the relevant period. Records of Wisengamot proceedings from November 1981, specifically any proceedings related to the placement of Lord Paramount minors, and any records pertaining to the Dumbledore authority invoked in my placement. He looked at Diggle. This is an inquiry, not an accusation. I want documentation, nothing more. Diggle said, of course, in the voice of a man who was not sure of anything at all but understood that of course was currently the safest available answer. Good, Harry said. Is there anything else? Brocklehurst gathered himself for one more attempt. Lord Paramount, the Ministry would appreciate, we think it would be of mutual benefit, a regular point of contact. Someone within the Ministry who could serve as a liaison, facilitate communication. Sharpstone handles my administrative communications, Harry said. Anything for me goes through Gringotts. That is somewhat unconventional. Yes, Harry agreed. He stood. I appreciate you coming. I'll expect the inquiry documentation within 10 working days. They left. Sharpstone said in the quiet after the door closed, Diggle will be replaced within a month. He is not the Ministry's final answer. I know, Harry said. He's their opening position. He looked at the door. Who is their final answer likely to be? Someone Fudge trusts not to be outmaneuvered by an 8-year-old, Sharpstone said. He said it without inflection, which was its own kind of commentary. Harry said, let me know when they decide. He picked up the casket and went back upstairs. Dumbledore came on Thursday. Harry had thought he would come with documentation or a solicitor, or at minimum the specific preparedness of a man who had been chief warlock of the Wisengamot for decades and understood that formal encounters required formal preparation. Instead, he came alone and without paperwork and knocked on the door of the third-floor flat in a building that he should not have been able to locate. Harry stood on the other side of the door and was precisely still. Then he opened it. Albus Dumbledore in a corridor was a different proposition than Albus Dumbledore in a photograph. The photographs Harry had found in the Daily Prophet archive, archived editions going back 20 years, accessible through the Gringotts library, showed a man who was large in the way certain public figures are large, enlarged by proximity to events that enlarged everyone in them. The man in the corridor was large differently, not diminished, but actual, old in the specific way of things that have accumulated rather than declined. His eyes were blue the way deep water is blue, a color that has depth as a quality, not just appearance. He looked at Harry with an attention that was not the particular attention of someone doing an assessment. It was something else, something Harry did not have a word for at 8, but which he recognized by its effect. It made him feel looked at by someone who was looking at him and not at what he represented. "May I come in?" Dumbledore said. Harry stepped aside. He gave Dumbledore the better chair, the desk chair, which was actually the larger of the two, and sat across from him on the cot's edge, the casket between them on the floor. Dumbledore sat in the desk chair as if the desk chair were entirely adequate, which it was, and folded his hands in his lap and looked at Harry in the still flat morning light from the window. "You filed an inquiry into my authority," he said. "Yes." "Would you like me to explain it?" "Yes," Harry said. "All of it, please." So Dumbledore explained. He spoke for 17 minutes and he did not use notes and he did not soften the explanation and he did not wrap it in the particular folksy warmth Harry had read about in the accounts of people who knew him. He spoke plainly with the specific plainness of someone who has decided that plain is the only available option. The rebounded killing curse. The fragment of Voldemort, perhaps more than a fragment, I am still determining the extent that had not died when the rest of him apparently had. The probability which Dumbledore assessed as near certainty that Voldemort would find a way to return. The blood protection. Lily's death, freely chosen, invoking a sacrificial magic old enough to predate the Charter, embedding itself in the blood of her nearest living relative, requiring that relative to acknowledge Harry as family for the wards to function. The requirement, as Dumbledore had understood it, that Harry actually live in the house. "I know that last part is not the legal requirement," Dumbledore said, and he said it without the particular tonal quality Harry had expected, the quality of a man caught out, managing the revelation. He said it the way someone says a thing they have been deciding whether to say and have arrived at the conclusion that not saying it is a worse problem. "I learned this when the inquiry documentation request went to the ministry. It prompted me to reread the original wardsmanship texts." A pause. "The texts specify residential acknowledgement of record, not physical habitation." He looked at Harry. "I was wrong." The words sat in the room with the flat reality of things stated without management. "Why did you think it required me to live there?" Harry said. "I believed the protection's integrity depended on your occupying the role of dependent, not consciously maintaining a strategic position. I thought the psychological reality of the thing mattered as much as the legal fact of it." He paused. "I believed that a child who understood he was living in a protected location would behave differently than a child who simply lived there, and that the difference in behavior would weaken the ward." He looked at Harry. "This was a theory without direct evidence. I built a decision on a theory and I did not revisit the evidence base." Harry looked at him. "How long was I supposed to live there?" "Until you reached 17, the age of magical majority. 9 more years." "Yes." The room was quiet. Outside, the cobblestones carried the sounds of the alley going about its morning. Harry thought about 9 years. He thought about them specifically in 9 more years of the particular cold of the cupboard, the particular management required by Vernon's moods, the particular arithmetic of Petunia's unpredictable feeding schedule. He set the 9 years against the blood ward and the fragment of Voldemort and the near-certain return of a dark wizard who had already killed his parents. "The wards are still important," he said. "Yes. More important than my having been wrong about the mechanism. I'm going to continue the residential acknowledgement," Harry said. "Once a year, by documented statement through Gringotts, the wards will hold." He looked at Dumbledore. "But I'm not going back." Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. He was looking at Harry with the deep-water blue eyes, and what was in them was not calculation. Harry could identify calculation by now, had catalogued it across Malfoy and Brocklehurst in 3 days of institutional maneuvering, and this was not it. This was something else, something less structured. "No," Dumbledore said, "I don't imagine you are." "The Hogwarts Review Ordinance stands," Harry said. "I'm not looking to dismantle anything. I want to understand what the school teaches and why and whether there are things it isn't teaching that it should be." After 12 months, I'll release whatever holds up. I can work with that, Dumbledore said. I would prefer to cooperate with the review rather than wait for it. That would be more efficient, Harry agreed. The inquiry, Dumbledore said, into my authority in placing you. It's informational, Harry said. It generates a record. I want there to be a record of the circumstances because I think the absence of a record was itself a problem. It meant there was no accountability structure, no one to ask whether the arrangement was working, no formal check. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I'm not trying to prosecute anyone. I want the circumstances documented so they can't be repeated. Dumbledore was quiet for a longer interval. For another child, he said. Yes. Dumbledore looked out the window at the alley cobblestones. He looked at the casket on the floor between them. He looked back at Harry. I would have done it again, he said. 6 months ago, before you walked into Gringotts, I would have done exactly the same thing for the same reasons in the same way. I want to be clear about that. He met Harry's eyes. I am clear about that, and I am saying it to you directly because I think you deserve to hear it directly rather than discover it by inference. Harry looked at him. But I would not, Dumbledore said. Do it again now, not because the charter prevents it, because I am looking at you. He paused. And I can see what 9 years of that calculation would have cost, and I think I was wrong to believe the cost was separable from the protection. I thought I could have one without the other. Safety and belonging, Harry said. He said it because Dumbledore's expression had been building toward those words since he sat down, and Harry had learned to recognize when someone was working toward a thing. Yes, Dumbledore looked at him, and the look had a quality Harry could not categorize. Not pity, he knew pity. It looked like what Vernon's friends did when they saw Harry's clothes. Not guilt exactly, something older. Something that had been sitting in Dumbledore's chest for a while and had been waiting, apparently, for an 8-year-old in a room above Diagon Alley to give it space. They are not the same thing. I prioritized safety because I understood it as the more essential of the two. I am not sure, sitting here, that I was right about the hierarchy. I am, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. Safety was right, Harry said. I'm alive. Voldemort didn't find me. The blood wards worked. The calculation was correct. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. It was the only calculation. That's the part that was wrong. You calculated safety. Nobody calculated the rest. He paused. That's what the inquiry will document, not that you made the wrong decision, that you made the only decision and that the absence of anyone else making any other decisions about me is a structural failure, not a personal one. Dumbledore sat with this for a long time. You are, he said, 8 years old. Yes, Harry said. I know. Dumbledore stood. He was very tall in the small room. He looked around at the bookshelf with its 3 library books and the empty shelves above them, at the rucksack on the cot, at the bare desk where the charter folder was not, because Harry kept it in the casket and the casket was on the floor. He looked at all of it with the expression of someone taking an inventory of something he had not expected to have to reckon with. He moved to the door. He stopped, hand on the frame, and said without turning, "The review for Hogwarts." Yes, Harry said. What do you want to find? Harry thought about this, not the political answer, the actual one. A school that teaches children what the magical world actually is, he said, not what's convenient to teach. What's true about how power works, how law works, how history actually went, what they'll need. He looked at Dumbledore's back, and a school that notices when something is wrong with a child. Dumbledore did not move for a moment. I can work with that, he said. He opened the door. I will cooperate fully with the inquiry documentation. You will have everything I have. Thank you, Harry said. Dumbledore left. The door closed. Harry sat on the cot's edge in the quiet room and looked at the space where Dumbledore had been, and the feeling that came was not triumph, which would have been the wrong feeling, and not grief, which would have been more honest but was not yet available to him, and not relief. It was something more specific and more difficult. He had been looked at by someone who had made decisions about him across 8 years without looking, who had sat down in a too small chair in a room above Diagon Alley and looked. The looking could not undo the 9 years of the cupboard or the trowel or the cold. It could not undo the specific texture of being managed rather than known, but it was real. That was its own weight. He sat with it. Then he opened the casket. He took out the charter. He turned to the dissolution clause and read it again very carefully, the way Professor Hobb had annotated it in the copy she delivered Monday morning, with the secondary provisional framework provision marked in her sharp penciled notation. He read it twice. He closed the charter. He put it back in the casket. He was not going to invoke it. Not today, not this month, possibly not at all. The review ordinances were doing what they needed to do, creating a mechanism of accountability, a formal structure of oversight where none had existed. The inquiry would create a record. These were the minimum necessary moves made precisely. The dissolution clause was something else. It was available. he knew it was available in the specific, settled way he knew things that he had understood completely. He did not need to use it today. He went to the window. The alley below was at its mid-morning rhythm. An old witch was arguing with a broomstick vendor over a price written on a tag. A pair of children, older than Harry, 12 perhaps 13, were buying ice cream from a cart and laughing at something one of them had said. Two men were moving a delivery crate into the back of a shop, and one of them dropped his end and said something impolite, and the other one laughed. People. An entire world of them going about the specific ordinary business of a Tuesday, in a street that smelled of apothecary reagents and coffee and early summer. His world. Constitutionally, legally, in the precise, unambiguous terms of a 9-century-old document authenticated by the most sovereign financial institution in magical Britain. Every wand, every ward. Every creature and territory and institution. He looked at the people on the cobblestones. He was 8 and slightly small for 8, and he was standing in a window in a room with 3 library books and a rucksack and a casket that weighed considerably more than its size suggested. And the morning was doing the thing it did where everything looked possible, and none of the people moving through the alley below were looking up. He reached out and pulled the curtain most of the way across. Not closed, just most of the way. He was going to need more books. He was going to need to keep reading the charter, the parts Professor Hobb had translated and the parts he'd understood himself and the parts he still wasn't sure about. He was going to need to think carefully about what the review ordinances were going to find and what he was going to do with what they found. He was going to need eventually to go to Hogwarts because whatever else was true, it was a school, and he needed an education. Not just the charter, not just constitutional mechanics and legal terminology and the vocabulary of governance, but the actual substance of the magical world, which he had existed inside for 8 years and understood almost nothing of. He was going to need to work out what he wanted, which was a harder problem than what he was owed and one he had only just started approaching. He had time. The most immediate deadlines were managed. The next set of problems were 12 months away mostly, and the ones after those were further. He went and sat at the desk and pulled a piece of paper toward him and began a list. 3 weeks after Harry's departure, on a Tuesday that was otherwise unremarkable, Petunia Dursley came in from the garden to find an envelope on the kitchen mat. It bore the Gringotts seal, a circular embossing in deep red wax pressed with an authority that made the ordinary post around it look like it had never quite convinced anyone of its validity. She opened it at the kitchen table, standing, because she knew what it was before she read it. She had been knowing what it was going to say in the general sense since the morning Harry had come in through the back door with a lead box that she'd had no right to recognize and had recognized immediately. 2 paragraphs, plain language. The first paragraph concerned the wardship of Harry James Potter, formally transferred, effective 3 weeks prior, to the custodial guardianship of Sharpstone of Gringotts Vault Nation per Article 7 Emergency Provisions of the Lord Paramount's Charter, all parties notified, documentation filed and archived. Second paragraph concerned the blood ward anchored to 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey, presently active and operational, renewable annually by residential acknowledgement of record from the Lord Paramount, anticipated to remain functional until the Lord Paramount's 18th birthday, at which point the natural expiry of the protection would release all parties from the arrangement's obligations in full. No action required on her part, no further obligations beyond those already fulfilled. It was not a punishment notice. It did not use the word neglect. It did not use the word abuse. It did not use the word cupboard or cold or trowel or any specific word at all. And this, the absence of specific words, was the document's most precise quality, the quality that made Petunia Dursley sit down at the kitchen table without intending to. At the bottom, below the Gringotts authentication seal and the formal printed designation of Sharpstone as executing officer, a signature, Harry's handwriting. She knew it. She'd seen it on his school books when they came home at the end of term sometimes before she'd stopped looking. It was the handwriting of a child who had taught himself to write without being taught, functional, careful, slightly uneven at the letters that required changes of direction, thoroughly legible. A signature that was not trying to look like an adult signature. It simply was what it was. Harry James Potter, Lord Paramount. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in both hands. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the garden was immaculate, the roses trained, the borders straight, every bed weeded to the root. The work of a summer already spent in the specific way she had spent it. She looked out at the shed. The patched earth near its base was already greening over, the lawn coming in across the disturbed ground with the mindless persistence of growing things. In another season, it would be entirely invisible. You would not be able to tell where the box had been. She folded the letter in thirds. She put it in the drawer under the tea towels, underneath the rubber bands and the spare birthday candles and the takeaway menus they never used and all the other small residue of ordinary life. She did not throw it away. She would not throw it away. She closed the drawer and stood at the counter and looked at the garden for a long time, and then she went to put the kettle on because the kettle was the available thing, and because some things, in the absence of anything else, simply required continuation. In the room above Diagon Alley, Harry finished his list. It had 12 items. The first 3 were administrative, review documentation deadlines, the timeline for the inquiry response from the ministry, a follow-up with Professor Hobb about 2 clauses in the Charter's procedural section he wasn't fully satisfied he'd understood. The next 4 were educational, things he needed to learn specifically before September. The structure of the magical curriculum, the history of magical law, basic wand theory since he did not have a wand and had not yet addressed this, and the name of whoever ran the Hogwarts library, because the library seemed like the most important room in any school, and he wanted to understand what was in it before he arrived. The last 5 items were different, not administrative, not educational. He looked at them. What Voldemort was, what he wanted, what fragment of him survived, who my parents were, not what happened to them, who they were. What a friend is, practically speaking, requirements, logistics, what Hogwarts is like when it isn't being reviewed, what I want. He looked at the last item for a moment, then he put a question mark after it because it was the most honest punctuation. He put the list in the casket's lid pocket. There was a pocket, stitched into the interior of the lid with thread that was not quite silk, that he'd found on his 4th examination of the casket's interior and that he suspected was intended for exactly this. Small documents, working notes, the ongoing record of a life being managed. He closed the lid, he put the casket on the desk, he stood at the window, the alley was going into its afternoon, the ice cream cart had moved on, the children were gone. The delivery crate had been moved inside and the shop door was closed. The witch and the broomstick vendor had apparently reached a resolution because both were gone and the tag in the window now bore a different number. Harry looked at all of it. He was 8 years old. He held more constitutional authority than anyone in magical Britain had held in 4 centuries, and the experience of it was not what power was supposed to feel like in any story he had ever read, was not warm or righteous or certain. It was cold and precise and very heavy, and it required him to be careful at all times, and it had not given him a single thing that he had not also had to take. But it was his, in the specific, unambiguous, legally authenticated sense, it was his. He watched the cobblestones for a while longer. He watched a man close his shop and a woman read something posted in a window and turn away again, and 2 pigeons conduct a territorial dispute over a pastry from the bakery next door. Then he went to the shelf and took down one of the library books, the one on early magical history, which was overdue but which he intended to read completely before addressing the fine, and sat on the cot and opened it. He had a lot to learn. He had better start.